Under the watchful eyes of the town, the Lang family appeared flawless. Their estate stood at the edge of the village like a monument of stability, its stone walls lined with ivy, and its windows glowing warm with candlelight each evening. Locals whispered of their fortune, earned through trade and careful investments, and of their piety, proven by generous donations to the church and endless baskets of food left at the doors of the poor. The patriarch, Nathaniel Lang, was seen as a man of rare integrity, a figure of calm authority whose prayers at Sunday service carried a weight that silenced even restless children. His wife, Eleanor, was admired for her gentleness, her lace gloves, and her kind words, painting a picture of womanly virtue. The Lang children, dressed in clean white garments, were paraded through the town like angels born of prosperity. From a distance it was impossible to see anything but goodness. Yet the house itself seemed to keep secrets. Its stone walls, older than the family that owned them, were said to have been laid on ground that once held an infirmary, where fever victims were buried quickly and in silence. Travelers often remarked on the heavy air that surrounded the estate, how birds avoided its chimneys, and how even the horses pulling carts would shudder as they passed the iron gate. To the villagers, these were curiosities to be ignored. The Langs gave too much and appeared too perfect for anyone to question what lay hidden. But inside the manor, where the curtains were never lifted at night, another world existed. Nathaniel's study was the heart of this hidden life. The room smelt not of ink or paper as one might expect, but of earth and resin, of minerals pulled from the ground and locked away in jars along the shelves. Books bound in leather were stacked in precise rows, their spines marked not with titles but with single initials and strange glyphs. To the servants, the study was a forbidden space, one that Nathaniel entered with a quiet intensity that drained him pale when he emerged hours later. He was a man of rituals. His generosity in public was matched by an obsessive order in private. He measured his steps as he moved about the study, always aligning his movements with lines carved into the floorboards, as though tracing a geometry no one else could see. In his notebooks, the writing shifted from prayers to calculations, lists of minerals, and sketches of lungs and skulls. The man who blessed children at Sunday service was the same man who, by candlelight, drew diagrams of how silence could be captured and preserved inside bone. Eleanor, too, played her part. Her tenderness, admired by townsfolk, was not a mask she wore only in public. She was tender even in her secrecy, soft in her devotion to the family's hidden practices. When one of her children fell ill, she was not merely a mother soothing fevers. She was a keeper of rituals, placing stones beneath the child's pillow and whispering words of sleep as she stitched strands of the child's hair into small cloth sachets. Neighbors who visited spoke of her calmness in the face of sickness, how she never wept or panicked but moved gracefully, as if guided by a higher knowledge. They did not know that her calmness came from certainty. In her heart, she believed no illness could steal what had already been marked. Her children, like her husband, were part of a destiny too carefully written to be undone by something so ordinary as disease. The servants felt the estate's darkness in ways the family never revealed. They described hearing movement in the corridors at night, footsteps too light to belong to adults and too many to belong to the few children that lived there. They spoke of rooms locked for months at a time, then suddenly aired out with strong scents of herbs and lye. The Langs dismissed such worries with smiles, attributing them to superstition, and the servants, grateful for their wages, said no more. But their unease lingered. The estate was both a sanctuary and a prison, its stone halls echoing with whispers no one wished to trace. What made the Langs so dangerous was not madness but patience. They moved like a family that understood the weight of time, always planning, always arranging. Nathaniel's decisions reached years ahead, his investments paying off decades later, his acquisitions of land and property always leaving him steps beyond his peers. To most it was evidence of genius. To those who watched more closely it was unnatural. How could a man predict the turn of fortunes with such precision? How could a family walk through tragedy with such unbroken composure? And why, in the churchyard, were grave plots already purchased by Nathaniel in a corner far larger than his family required? The truth was buried deeper than suspicion, buried beneath the image of perfection. The Langs' life was a stage, every smile and every act of charity carefully rehearsed. Yet behind those gestures was a devotion to something colder, something that had little to do with the God they prayed to in public. The estate itself seemed to bend around this devotion, each brick and board holding the silence of what was never spoken. And in that silence, in the spaces between public piety and private obsession, something older began to stir, not a madness that rushed in with chaos, but an evil that grew slowly, methodically, taking root in stone and blood, waiting for its time to emerge. In the records of the small parish where births and deaths were written with careful ink, an odd entry began to repeat itself over the years. It was always the same hand, neat and deliberate, paying in advance for spaces in the churchyard. Nathaniel Lang appeared often, not only reserving plots for himself and his wife, but also for children not yet born, their names inscribed with eerie precision long before a midwife ever cut a cord. To the priest it was a curiosity at first, then a discomfort. No man in the village made such preparations. Death was a certainty, yes, but no one dared to name graves before life had even stirred in the womb. Nathaniel explained it with calm logic, telling the priest he wished his family to rest together, to spare them the chaos of being separated in the afterlife. The priest, uneasy but bound by gratitude for the Langs' donations, let the explanation stand. The ledger grew heavy with his handwriting. Some names belonged to infants who would later be born, baptized, and lost before their first teeth had grown. Others belonged to children who had not yet been conceived when Nathaniel first carved their futures into the pages of burial contracts. To the townsfolk, the Langs' losses seemed tragic but strangely unsurprising, as if the family carried a curse that stole their young. What few noticed was that each child died in the exact order their names appeared in Nathaniel's neat lines of ink. When confronted gently, he would speak of fate, of divine will, and of the importance of preparing one's soul and body for the inevitable. Those who pressed further often regretted it. Nathaniel's gaze, though soft, carried a weight that silenced further questions. The whispers began slowly, carried by those who dared look too closely. Was it possible that he was not preparing for death but shaping it? That he had already written his children into the ground before they had even cried for the first time? His precision unsettled them. It was not a father protecting his family's future, but a man obsessed with controlling the boundary between life and death. To some, it felt like blasphemy, a human hand attempting to write God's script. To others, it was worse, as if the graves themselves were contracts with something older, a silent pact sealed long before the children had names of their own. In the evenings, as townsfolk passed the Lang estate, the air seemed heavier, the shadows longer. They spoke in hushed tones of how Nathaniel walked the graveyard alone at night, pausing at the stones already marked with his children's names, running his fingers over them as though checking a ledger of debts waiting to be collected. Some swore they saw him place small tokens at the bases of the stones, shards of glass, dead insects, scraps of cloth that had belonged to the children. Whether it was true or not, the vision grew in their minds, and with it the fear that the Lang patriarch's faith was not directed toward heaven, but toward something that demanded payment in innocence. Still, none would dare accuse him openly. His reputation, his wealth, and his aura of holiness protected him. The priest kept quiet, convincing himself it was superstition. Neighbors turned away from their unease, telling themselves tragedy struck all families, though not with such cold order. Only the ledger locked in the parish chest bore silent witness to the truth, that Nathaniel Lang had written his children into the grave before they ever had a chance to live. And as the years passed, each name was crossed through with a burial date that matched his dark foresight exactly, leaving behind a chilling record of life mapped to death with the precision of a man who seemed less father than executioner. From the moment each Lang child entered the world, their life carried the weight of a shadow they could never escape. While neighbors celebrated their births with gifts of wool and bread, a darker celebration had already taken place in silence. Their names, chosen long before the cries of infancy, were already carved into stone, resting cold in the churchyard. To the townsfolk, it seemed a sign of forethought or superstition. But within the Lang estate, it was regarded as a kind of covenant. The children grew beneath the watchful eyes of their parents, clothed in fine garments, fed with care, surrounded by an affection that felt almost suffocating. They were kissed often, praised often, and tucked into their beds with lullabies that spoke softly of eternal sleep. The strangest part was that the Langs seemed to love their children more than any family in the parish. Yet their love was not for the future, but for the ritual of preparing them to be taken. Nathaniel spoke to them of purity and silence, urging them to avoid loud games and to sit still for hours as he read passages of scripture or pages from his own cryptic journals. Eleanor cradled them with a softness that concealed a deeper training, teaching them to lie motionless when told and to fold their hands across their chests as if already posed for burial. The children did not know that this discipline was not meant for life, but for the precision of death. The accidents began quietly, each one unfolding with a methodical cruelty that seemed too exact to be chance. A daughter drowned in the shallow pond, though she had been a skilled swimmer. A son suffocated when curtains caught fire, yet the flames burnt only around his small bed and left the rest of the room untouched. Another child fell from the staircase after being told to descend alone in the dark. Each incident bore the appearance of tragedy, yet each matched the order of the names etched in stone years earlier. Neighbors shook their heads in sorrow, pitying the Langs for their cursed misfortune, never daring to imagine that what appeared as grief was in truth fulfillment of a plan. Behind closed doors, the house was a place of rehearsed mourning. Eleanor dressed the bodies herself, sewing their shrouds with strands of her own hair. Nathaniel conducted the funerals with cold authority, his voice breaking in practiced tones as he delivered eulogies he had likely written before the children had ever spoken their first words. What unsettled those who attended was not the tragedy but the composure. Tears came, but always at the right moment, always restrained, as though the performance of grief was another ritual in the pattern of their lives. The graves filled one by one exactly as the ledger predicted, until the churchyard corner looked less like a place of rest and more like a family garden of silence, tended carefully by the hands that had planted it. For the Langs, the children were never meant to grow old. They were chapters to be completed, names to be crossed from a list, and steps in a dark arithmetic that Nathaniel controlled with unwavering devotion. Their short lives, nurtured with obsessive tenderness, ended as swiftly as they began, leaving behind a chilling truth. In the Lang household, love and death were not opposites. They were the same language spoken with the same careful tongue, both leading to the same inevitable grave. When the Lang estate finally changed hands decades after the family's decline, workmen tasked with repairs uncovered a narrow passage hidden behind a rotted wall. It led to a door without a handle, its wood sealed with layers of pitch as if meant never to be opened. When forced, the air that escaped was heavy and sour, thick with the staleness of years. Inside, the men found not dust and ruin, but a room arranged with dreadful care. Against the walls stood wax figures, each no taller than a child, their forms eerily lifelike in detail. The faces bore familiar features drawn from parish records and portraits, clear imitations of the Lang children who had died so young. But there was something more grotesque than simple remembrance. Their mouths had been sealed shut with hardened resin, thick and dark as though meant to trap something inside. Their eyes were not painted but drilled through, leaving black pinholes that stared blankly forward, giving the figures the appearance of watching yet never seeing. The wax itself carried a strange quality, as though blended with more than simple candle remnants. Fragments of hair could be seen pressed into the surface, and beneath the sheen of hardened layers there were veins of discolored matter that looked disturbingly organic. The figures were dressed in faded garments once belonging to the children themselves, stitched clumsily at the seams, as if meant to preserve a likeness of the living while binding them forever in stillness. Each effigy sat in silence, positioned not in a random arrangement but in perfect rows, like students in a classroom awaiting a lesson that would never come. Among the effigies were journals stacked neatly on a desk at the far end of the chamber. Written in Nathaniel Lang's careful hand, they revealed a mind consumed by one thought: the conquest of corruption. He wrote of how the body betrayed life with decay, how breath, once gone, could never be reclaimed. Yet he believed that in the moment of death, something invisible escaped, something he called the essence of purity. To him, wax was a vessel, a trap that could hold what air alone could not, He described placing each child's body beside a vat of warm wax, speaking prayers as the final breath left their lips, then pouring the mixture over strands of their hair, drops of their blood, and fragments of their clothing. The effigies to Nathaniel were not symbols of grief, but prisons designed to capture what time sought to destroy. It was not only memory he wanted to preserve. He was chasing the illusion of eternal ownership, the belief that if he could stop the corruption of flesh, he could keep the children from leaving him entirely. He wrote that sealing their mouths kept the soul from escaping through speech, while drilling the eyes allowed the essence to pass inward and bind itself to the wax. In his mind, these figures were not lifeless statues. They were vessels, silent and unchanging, holding fragments of life suspended forever under his control. What horrified those who discovered the chamber was not simply the presence of the effigies, but the precision of the obsession. Each entry in the journals matched perfectly with the deaths recorded in the parish. Nathaniel had planned every figure, every ritual with a methodical calm that left no doubt these were not acts of grief, but of design. He did not build the effigies to remember his children. He built them to contain them, to ensure they could never be free from him, not in life, not in death. The chamber was sealed again after its discovery, but the memory of it spread quickly through the town. Some said the air inside had felt heavy, as though a dozen unheard breaths still lingered in the space, trapped for eternity in wax that would never melt. Others swore that the effigies seemed to lean forward when the candlelight flickered, their hollow eyes reflecting the light like glass, as if they were not watching but waiting. The journals and hidden chambers revealed that the Long children did not meet their ends through misfortune, but through rituals so calculated that even death itself seemed choreographed. Nathaniel Long did not see himself as a killer, but as a conductor of silence, orchestrating each passing with an order that was both clinical and ceremonial. In his writings, he described the tongue as the first betrayal of purity, a vessel of noise, sin, and temptation. To prevent it from carrying corruption into the next life, he pressed each child's tongue between thin panes of glass until the muscle flattened and stiffened, the blood held inside like an insect trapped in amber. He wrote that only in silence could innocence remain unbroken. The lungs to him were the true prison of decay. He obsessed over the idea that breath carried away the essence of purity as it left the body. His solution was to suffocate each child, not with cloth or rope, but with quicklime dust poured slowly into their mouths and nostrils. The burning powder would sear the fragile tissue and fill the cavities until no final exhalation could escape unclaimed. Nathaniel described it as binding the air, trapping it before corruption could turn it foul. To outsiders, the deaths appeared sudden and unexplainable, but to him, they were victories, proof that he had stolen back what nature would have dissolved. The heart was his final fixation. He considered it a reckless engine beating blindly until it wasted life into time. In the journals, he wrote of plunging his children into baths of ice, submerging their small bodies until the frantic beating slowed to silence. The water, he noted, washed them of heat and impulse, leaving them clean, suspended, and still. He referred to this ritual as the quieting, a term he underlined again and again, as if the word itself carried sacred power. The method was not rage, but ritual, Not cruelty born of passion, but devotion to an idea that death could be reshaped into something controlled, precise, and permanent. Each child's death when seen by neighbors looked like an accident or illness. A fever that took them in the night, a fainting spell that ended in stillness. A child found motionless after wandering too long into the cold. But within the estate, these stories were masks hiding the truth of what had been done. Nathaniel had stripped away the chaos of mortality, leaving behind only the silence he craved. The wax effigies in the hidden room were not symbols of grief, but monuments to his success, each one holding what he believed was the preserved essence of a silenced child. The rituals revealed not only a father's obsession, but also a family's complicity. Eleanor, in her gentleness, became the hand that comforted even as she prepared the garments and herbs for the final moments. Her lullabies were not prayers for survival, but songs that soothed her children as they drifted toward a silence chosen for them long before they understood its meaning. What looked like love was something else entirely. The calm obedience of a woman who believed silence was salvation. With each ritual, the Langs drew further from the world of the living, reshaping their home into a sanctuary of quiet deaths. And as the years passed, the ledger of burials matched perfectly with the rituals described. A chilling pattern that showed the children were not taken by chance but by design. Their graves were not the end of tragedy, but proof of a practice that blurred the line between piety and horror, leaving behind a legacy built not of love, but of silence. The town carried the weight of whispers, but no voice dared to give them shape. Each time a Lang child was lowered into the earth, the villagers stood at the graveside, their heads bowed, their lips moving in prayer, yet their eyes straying toward one another in quiet unease. They noticed the pattern, though none admitted it aloud. They saw how Nathaniel had already claimed the ground for the next child before the last had even grown old enough to read. They saw how Eleanor stood at the burials without tears, her hands folded neatly, her expression serene, as if she had already rehearsed the part of mourning. They saw it all, but the Langs' wealth, their charity, and their aura of righteousness held the town in a grip stronger than iron. The clergy sealed the silence more firmly than any locked door. Each funeral was sanctified with blessings, the priest speaking of God's trials and the mysteries of divine will. To him, the Langs were the perfect example of endurance, a family chosen to suffer, their losses turned into lessons for the faithful. He did not ask why these trials fell only upon one household. He did not question how every death matched the names already etched in stone. Instead, he raised his hands over the coffins and told the townsfolk that to question was to sin. The churchyard filled with the small graves of the Lang children, and with each one blessed, suspicion was forced deeper underground, buried beside them. Neighbors, too, chose blindness. They accepted food and coins from the Lang estate when times were lean, grateful for the baskets of bread and meat that arrived at their doors in winter. They smiled at Eleanor in the marketplace and complimented her lace, though their stomachs turned when they noticed how her eyes seemed to soften most when gazing at a cradle soon to be emptied. They nodded respectfully to Nathaniel as he walked the town square, his black coat pressed, his hat tipped with solemn dignity, though their thoughts lingered on the faint scent of resin and earth that seemed to follow him. They saw the signs, But to speak of them would mean cutting themselves off from the family whose money carried weight in the church, the courts, and even their daily survival. Over time, the town convinced itself of lies easier to swallow. They said the Langs were cursed, that death had chosen their bloodline, that it was beyond human control. Others said God tested the righteous more than the wicked, and that Nathaniel and Eleanor's composure was proof of holy strength, not guilt. The more uncomfortable truth that the deaths were deliberate, planned, and methodical, festered at the edges of every thought but was pushed away with desperate silence. For to admit it would mean admitting that they had stood by, that they had watched children die and said nothing. And so the Langs continued, their estate standing as a monument not only to their wealth but also to the town's cowardice. Each grave was not only the mark of a child silenced but also of a community that had chosen blindness over truth. Evil hid behind lace gloves and Sunday prayers, and the people, whether out of fear, greed, or faith, allowed it to flourish. The town's silence became as much a ritual as Nathaniel's own, a collective burial of conscience that left the Lang family untouchable, their darkness shielded by the very people who should have spoken first. When Eleanor Lang finally passed, the town mourned her as a figure of grace, a woman who had borne endless tragedy with unshakable dignity. At her funeral, neighbors spoke of her calm, her soft voice, and her tireless devotion to charity. They remembered the sight of her standing at the foot of so many small graves, a pillar of sorrow who never collapsed under the weight. But when her possessions were sorted in the weeks that followed, something surfaced that tore away the mask. Hidden in the false bottom of a chest were journals bound in faded cloth, each filled with Eleanor's careful hand. What began as entries of daily life, recipes, prayers, records of sewing, grew darker with each page until the writing became a record of rituals written in a voice as serene as her public face. She wrote of preparing each child for death as if it were a holy duty. She described stitching garments of fine linen, sewing into the seams strands of the child's own hair and scraps of their worn clothing, believing that these fibers would bind them to purity as their lives were taken. She noted with chilling detail the way she washed their bodies before the rituals, not as a mother caring for the sick, but as a servant preparing an offering. The water, she wrote, was mixed with salt and crushed herbs to cleanse the child of noise, to strip them of the world's weight before silence claimed them. She called it the dressing of innocence, a phrase repeated with the devotion of prayer. Her lullabies, remembered by neighbors as sweet and calming, were revealed in the journals to be coded instructions for surrender. She taught her children to sing of endless sleep, to close their eyes and fold their hands, and to let go without resistance. The songs, she explained, softened the fear that might otherwise interrupt the purity of the ritual. She believed the children had to go willingly, that their silence had to be embraced, not stolen in panic. To her, this was love, to make the path smooth, to ease the terror, to deliver them into quiet with a mother's hand guiding them. In one entry, she confessed her own transformation, writing that at first she resisted Nathaniel's designs, but over time she began to see the beauty in them. She believed that by participating she was saving her children from the corruption of the world, delivering them to a state of stillness untouched by sin. Her voice in the journals was not hysterical or broken, but calm, steady, almost proud. She recorded each ritual garment as one might list completed chores, every stitch described with precision, every lullaby written as if it were scripture. The discovery of these writings destroyed the illusion of innocence that had shielded her memory. Eleanor was not simply a mother crushed by grief, nor a victim of her husband's will. She was a partner in the silence, a woman who wrapped her children in garments meant for burial and sang them into death with a softness that masked the horror of her intent. Her hands, praised in life for their gentleness, were revealed to have been instruments of complicity, weaving strands of love and death into the same fabric. And as the town read the words she left behind, they realized that the Lang tragedy had never been the curse of fate. It had been a plan shared by both father and mother, carried out with devotion, precision, and calm. When investigators pried into the remnants of the Lang estate decades after the family's fall, they uncovered a collection of notebooks bound in cracked leather hidden beneath loose floorboards in Nathaniel's study. The pages were filled not with sermons or financial records, but with careful illustrations of bodies, some human, most animal, drawn with the detail of a surgeon and the obsession of a man who sought to conquer time itself. His writings revealed an endless fixation on the moment flesh began to rot, as though death itself was not the true enemy, but the corruption that followed. He dissected small animals, kittens, birds, and lambs, noting in rigid columns how long it took for the first signs of change to appear in muscle and skin. Each experiment was paired with attempts to stop the decay, and his methods grew darker with each entry. He began with salts, packing carcasses in layers of mineral until they shriveled into twisted husks. Dissatisfied, he moved to wax, pouring layers of it over flayed tissue, convinced it could seal in what he called the final breath of purity. When this failed to hold the illusion of life, he turned to fluids stolen from the dead. He obtained embalming mixtures used by undertakers, then altered them with tinctures of mercury, turpentine, and even ground bone. He injected these into the limbs of animals, sometimes into still-breathing creatures, noting with cold precision the moment where life ebbed but structure held. In one journal he described it as the perfect silence, a state where motion had ceased but the form remained unspoiled. His notes were methodical, each entry a chilling balance of science and ritual. He wrote of weighing the organs, recording their warmth as they cooled, measuring not in hours but in breaths. He described plunging bodies into mixtures of vinegar and ash, boiling them and freezing them, always seeking the one method that would stop corruption without shattering the vessel. In his mind, flesh was only a container. What mattered was holding it long enough that the purity inside could not escape. He never used words of cruelty or madness. He wrote as though he were a man of reason, conducting noble experiments for the sake of eternity. Yet every calculation, every experiment was another step away from the living world and further into obsession. The journals revealed that his children were not exceptions to these practices, but the culmination of them. The same methods tested on animals were later applied in secret rituals, carried out with a calm devotion. He noted how the lungs resisted quicker than expected, how wax poured over hair and skin seemed to hold traces of warmth, and how the cold of ice baths delayed decay more cleanly than any chemical. He wrote of these details not as a father recording grief, but as a scientist cataloging results. To him, death was not loss but proof, each child another experiment that brought him closer to his goal of preserving silence beyond time. The investigators who read these notebooks realized that Nathaniel's evil had never been about cruelty for its own sake. He did not kill for pleasure or rage. He killed for control. He believed he could master the most feared truth of existence, that everything rots, that nothing lasts, and replace it with his own order. His children were not victims of madness, but of an obsession that blurred the line between science and ritual, leaving behind not only graves but records of a man who sought to cage death itself. And in the brittle pages of those journals his voice remained calm, steady, and terrifyingly certain, as if even from the grave he was still instructing, still preserving, still reaching for eternal silence. When a servant of the Lang estate died suddenly of fever, leaving behind a frail boy with no kin, the Lang stepped forward to take him in. To the townsfolk, this act seemed to confirm everything they already believed about Nathaniel and Eleanor. Even in their sorrow, even after burying so many of their own children, they still had room in their hearts for another. The boy was clothed, fed, and given a place within the house as though he belonged to their bloodline. Neighbors praised their mercy, whispering that perhaps God, in his mysterious way, had given the Langs a second chance to raise a child who might live. For a brief season, hope seemed to follow the boy. He was seen running in the garden, laughter escaping through the tall hedges, his cheeks fuller than they had ever been. Eleanor would sit with him in the evenings, guiding his small hands through the stitches of cloth, teaching him hymns with the same gentleness she had once given her own children. Nathaniel, in turn, oversaw his studies with the precision of a father, instructing him in scripture and discipline. To the town, it was proof that the Langs still carried light. But inside the estate, the cycle had already begun again. In the Langs' private graveyard, hidden among the rows of stones, there was one untouched marker waiting. Its surface bore a name no villager had yet spoken aloud, the name of the orphan carved years before his arrival. Nathaniel had already prepared the place, the ink in the parish ledger written long before the boy had ever entered their lives. The act of taking him in was not mercy. It was inevitable. The boy's days grew ordered, his freedom narrowing beneath the weight of rituals disguised as care. He was taught to lie still for long stretches, to fold his arms across his chest, and to breathe quietly as Eleanor sang her strange lullabies. Nathaniel recorded his growth in his journals as if the child were a specimen, measuring his height, his weight, and even the strength of his pulse. At night, the boy was asked to sit before the wax effigies of the Yodam other children and told that silence was a virtue, and that stillness was a kind of prayer. The comfort he received in the early days gave way to confusion, then unease, though he was too young to name the dread that grew inside him. The townsfolk noticed changes but dismissed them. The boy no longer laughed in the garden. He no longer played with other children at the churchyard. His cheeks, once warm with health, became pale, his eyes heavy as though carrying secrets too large for his small frame. Neighbors said perhaps grief had caught up with him. Perhaps he was simply weak like the others. None of them knew that Nathaniel had already written his ending in ink, already prepared the ritual that would carry him into the same silence as those before him. And so the pattern continued, uninterrupted, unchallenged. The orphan, once seen as spared by fate, was never spared at all. He had only been folded into the Lang's order, another child born not of blood but of inevitability, destined to fill a grave long prepared for him. The stone that bore his name was not a marker of compassion, but a reminder that within the Lang household life was never granted freely. It was borrowed, measured, and then claimed in silence when the time was right. On certain nights the townsfolk remembered hearing bells, not the heavy toll of the church tower, but faint, brittle chimes that drifted across the fields like whispers made of glass. Some claimed it was the wind striking the windows of the Lang estate. Others swore it was the sound of charms hung in the garden to ward off evil. No one dared to investigate closely, for the bells always rang after a burial, when the soil was still fresh, when grief was still raw. The villagers told themselves it was imagination, a trick of the night air, yet the sound lingered faint and persistent, as though someone beneath the earth was trying to be heard. Decades later, when the grounds of the Lang family plot were exhumed during renovations of the churchyard, the truth surfaced. Investigators unearthed coffins not only lined with strange waxed cloth but also marked with a grotesque invention. Each lid bore bored-through holes with thin cords rising to the surface, attached to fragile glass bells that once rested above the soil. Inside, the wood told a story more chilling than any rumor. The inner panels were clawed with desperate scratches, shallow but frantic, the final record of small hands trying to escape the dark. The bells, long broken and silent, had been fastened to give the illusion of hope, yet they had become tools of torment. The children had rung them faintly, weakly, their cries reduced to brittle music in the night, their signals mistaken by neighbors for something harmless. Nathaniel's journals revealed the cruel reasoning. He believed purity could only be sealed if the child passed willingly into silence. To test their obedience, he allowed them to be buried alive with the means to call out. If they remained still, the ritual was pure. If they struggled, if they dared to pull the cord and make the bell sing, then their resistance was proof of corruption, and the coffin itself became their final prison until exhaustion stilled them. He wrote with cold pride that the bells measured the strength of innocence. The faint chimes were not cries for help to him, but proof that the ritual was working, that the body still fought even as the soul was claimed. What horrified investigators most was not only the evidence of suffering, but also the precision with which it had been designed. The bells were made of delicate glass, chosen because their sound was faint, almost impossible to hear beyond the estate walls. They were not meant for rescue, they were meant for ritual. Nathaniel had crafted a system where hope itself became a weapon, where the children's last breaths turned into brittle music no one could answer. The townsfolk who had once heard those ghostly chimes realized too late that they had been witnesses not to superstition but to the final struggles of the buried, their cries swallowed by indifference. The grave stood silent now, but the memory of those bells became part of the town's folklore, a haunting echo carried in the wind. Some swore that on cold nights they still heard them, fragile notes drifting through the dark, reminders of small hands clawing at wood, of voices turned into music for no one to hear. In that silence, the truth was clear. The Langs had not only stolen life, they had twisted death into a cruel theater where suffering itself became part of their ritual. When the estate's cellar was finally opened, investigators descended into air that smelt of rot long buried in stone. What they found was not the quiet storage of wine or grain, but a chamber of arrangement so grotesque it seemed built as a shrine to madness disguised as order. Along the walls and across the floor were skeletons, some unmistakably animal, others smaller, frailer, and unmistakably human. They were not left as bones scattered by time, but posed with deliberate care. Each rib cage spread and reinforced with wire, each skull angled toward the center as though awaiting command. The wires, fine and thin, threaded through bone like the strings of an instrument, their placement so exact that when air moved through the cellar's narrow cracks, the bones emitted faint whistling tones. It was not an accident. It was a choir. The journals left behind made Nathaniel's intent clear. He believed silence was not enough. He wanted it shaped, harnessed, and turned into sound that obeyed his hand. The children's deaths were not the end of their usefulness, but the beginning of another ritual. He described carefully stripping away flesh, preserving the ribs and measuring their angles to determine pitch. Birds were taken for high notes, lambs for mid-tones, and children for the deep resonance of purity. He wrote with pride that when the cellar filled, with wind on stormy nights, the chamber sang back to him. A chorus of innocence, forever bound to the silence he had demanded. The townsfolk who later heard of the discovery spoke in hushed disbelief, but the bones told the story too clearly to deny. Scratches still marked some of the ribs where wire had been tightened. Fractures showed the pressure of being bent into place. It was not the work of chaos, but of a mind that saw ritual in dissection and harmony in cruelty. To Nathaniel, the cellar was not a tomb, but a sanctuary, a place where death itself was taught to serve him, where the breath of the world outside was stolen and reshaped into his private hymn. And when investigators stood in that chamber, some swore they still heard it, the faint, uneven notes rising from hollow bones when the draft pushed through. Not music, not beauty, but the remnants of suffering remade into sound. A choir that had never chosen to sing, yet one that would echo long after the family who built it was gone. When the Lang estate finally gave way to time in the early years of the 20th century, it was not fire or abandonment that revealed its secrets, but the earth itself. Heavy rains loosened the foundations, and the grand house that had once stood as a monument to piety and wealth buckled into ruin. Walls collapsed inward, stones split like brittle bone, and the cellar flooded with mud. Workers who came to clear the wreckage uncovered more than broken masonry. Beneath the debris lay trenches cut with a precision that suggested not accident but design. As they dug deeper, they unearthed rows of skeletons, their small frames pressed tightly together. Their arrangement too neat to be chance. What had long been whispered as a curse and tragedy was now laid bare as fact. The Langs had not been victims of fate. They had been executioners cloaked in charity. Forensic study of the remains confirmed what the journals had already suggested. The bones carried marks of restraint, fractures inconsistent with natural death, jaws pried apart by force, and ribs blackened with traces of chemical burns. Some skulls showed holes drilled through them, aligning with the rituals Nathaniel had written of with such calm conviction. The pattern was undeniable. Each grave was another page in a ledger of silence, every burial a line in the dark arithmetic of a man who believed he could master decay by controlling the end of life itself. The investigators, hardened men accustomed to violence and death, were shaken not by the scale of the graves but by their order. Nothing about them was chaotic. Even in mass burial, Nathaniel's obsession with method was absolute. The town, confronted with the evidence, could no longer cling to denial. The church bells that had once tolled with compassion for the grieving Langs now rang with shame. Neighbors who had accepted charity from the family realized that their silence had bought them comfort at the cost of children's lives. The priest who had blessed the graves struggled to justify decades of complicity, his words faltering when faced with bones that bore scratches from desperate hands. The narrative of holy suffering collapsed with the estate, replaced by the horror of deliberate ritual murder carried out under the cover of piety. The ruins were left to rot, a scar on the edge of town, the soil too heavy with memory for anyone to build upon it again. Where once the estate had radiated wealth and faith, it now stood as a monument to denial, proof that evil had lived not in the shadows but in plain sight, sheltered by silence. And though the earth had given up its dead, the greater silence remained. The silence of a community that had looked away, and in doing so had become part of the ritual itself. In the years following the collapse of the Lang estate, the town was forced to reckon with the truth it had buried as carefully as the family once buried its children. The discovery of mass graves and the journals that detailed each ritual ignited debates that spread far beyond the village. Newspapers seized the story, framing it as both horror and cautionary tale. How could a family so respected, so pious, have hidden such a system of cruelty in plain sight? And how could a community bound by faith and fellowship have chosen silence over suspicion for so long? The Langs became a symbol of the dangers of unquestioned authority. Their evil not the sudden madness of violence, but the slow, deliberate twisting of love into ritual. Clergy across the region were forced to defend their silence. Priests who had once praised the Langs as examples of faith now struggled under accusations of complicity. Each blessing over each small coffin had in hindsight sanctified murder. The churchyard that had once been a place of reverence now stood as a field of shame. Its graves not holy ground but evidence of negligence and denial. Religious leaders debated whether the Langs had been driven by a corrupted form of faith, or had exploited the church's power to mask their obsession. The lines between belief and horror blurred until neither seemed safe from the other. Lawmakers, too, took notice. The Lang case ignited new discussions about parental authority and the unchecked control parents held over their children. It forced questions that polite society had never dared to ask. Should parents be trusted absolutely with their children's lives, or could devotion itself become a weapon when twisted by obsession? In whispers, some admitted the Langs were not monsters from another world, but reflections of what happens when silence protects cruelty and ritual replaces compassion. The estate itself was never rebuilt. Instead, a memorial was raised on the ruins, a simple stone marked with the names of the children confirmed through records and remains. Villagers came to lay flowers, but the air around the site never lost its weight. To some, it was a place of mourning. To others, it was a warning, a reminder that evil can wear lace gloves and carry prayer books, that generosity and grace can cloak an order more disturbing than open violence. And yet the question lingered, unanswered even as the years passed. How could such horror thrive undetected? Was it blindness, or was it a choice to look away? The legacy of the Langs was not only the graves, nor the journals, nor the ruined house. It was the echo of silence, the silence of a family who turned love into ritual, and of a town that let them. Evil rarely arrives with fire and madness. It seeps in quietly, disguised in order and generosity, in faces that appear calm and devout. The Langs were never seen screaming, never caught in a frenzy. Their rituals unfolded with the stillness of prayer, with the precision of science, and with the gentleness of parental hands that the town mistook for love. That was the lesson left behind. True horror does not need chaos to thrive. It only needs silence, a silence willingly given by those too fearful or too comfortable to question what stands before them. The Lang story was not just about one family's sickness. It became a mirror, forcing society to look at its own patterns of obedience. The villagers had seen the signs: children dying in sequence, graves purchased before birth, the sound of faint bells in the night. And yet they told themselves it was fate, or divine testing, or misfortune too terrible to name. Their silence was not ignorance. It was a choice, the choice to trust appearances rather than confront what their instincts already whispered. In that silence, the Langs found protection. In that silence, their rituals grew unchecked. History is full of such silences. Families, institutions, and entire nations have hidden their cruelty behind masks of tradition, faith, or order. Evil does not demand belief in its lies. It demands only that its lies not be challenged. The Langs showed how effective that mask can be, how innocence can be used as a shield, and how kindness can be wielded as a weapon to disarm suspicion. Their estate crumbled, their journals were exposed, but the lesson they left behind remains sharper than stone. That evil feeds not on madness, but on obedience. And so the story lingers with a question more haunting than any grave. Could it happen again? Could another family, another leader, another hand cloaked in piety or charm, build their own rituals of silence while the world looks away? The answer rests not with history, but with those who hear it. For the true danger was never only the Langs themselves, it was the silence that surrounded them.